to the very first Cygnal Pulse Pod of 2025, post a presidential election. And if you are listening to this, thanks for downloading and listening to wherever you grab your podcast. But if you're watching this, this is also not just the inaugural Pulse Pod for the year. It is actually the first time that we've ever done a video component. So now you realize why we have faces for radio. But hopefully the content is entertaining to you, and maybe you don't have to look as closely at us individually. But my name is Brent Buchanan. I'm president and founder of Cygnal, and joined here with John Rogers, one of our stellar pollsters and directors of client strategy. And so we're here to talk about our monthly NVT, which stands for National Voter Trends Survey that Cygnal's been doing for several years now. This was fielded February 5th, 4th and 5th. And so you're getting data that's just coming out of the field right now. And, you know, John, I think one of the things that really stuck out to us as we were both looking through and talking through this data was the fact that Donald Trump has a net job approval. And I remember the first Trump administration, he was completely upside down the entire time. And so we're pegging him at 50% approval, 48% disapproval, which anything right side up is just absolutely fascinating to me in this. And I know some others have slightly higher, but who they polled, ours is 2026 likely voters, because we're always looking ahead to the next election in our data. You know, he's only been president for a few weeks. What do you think is behind this optimism of, you know, people believing that he's going the right way with what he's doing in his admin?
I think a key part of it, Brent, is that the basic thing that the administration is trying to do, if you think about it, they are trying to address illegal immigration, and then they're trying to cut the size of government through DOGE, which I know we'll get into as we move along in this conversation. And those two actions on illegal immigration, on cutting the size of government, we found in our poll to be very popular, especially with swing voters, and then popular across the board. And so I think that explains a lot of it. It's not just that people are warming up to Trump a little bit more, but that the agenda that President Trump is pursuing is an agenda that the American people want to see happen.
Well, I mean, I do think there is something there to the fact that Donald Trump is viewed favorably also. You know, when I started doing polling for the official Trump Super PAC in 2015, he was already upside down, even before he was an elected official or an official candidate. And so I had always believed that nobody has a movable opinion of Donald Trump. Like you know who he is, and you know very strongly which way you lean towards him. But it seems like there's been a little bit of an elasticity there over the last 6 months or so. I don't know if it was because Biden was just so bad. And that's kind of one thing that I've wondered on why Trump's job approval is so strong, is because it's essentially he's not Biden, he's actually taking action. And it's kind of nice to see your president. It's kind of nice to hear from your president. Kind of nice to see him actually doing something as opposed to this shadow state behind the scenes. And so I've wondered too, is it as much the issues, or is it just simply the fact that Americans like action?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think you're right. I think it probably is both. And I think people in Washington, D.C., you know, we tend to have a narrow view of the last month or two, but you think about the way, as you said, the entire election went and who he was campaigning against. He was campaigning against an ineffectual, unpopular incumbent in Joe Biden. And then what Trump went through during the campaign, the near assassination attempt in Pennsylvania, the assassination attempt that was nearly successful, and then the second attempted assassination in Florida. And I mean, he in a lot of ways has become an iconic political figure.
Well, and what's driven a lot of that, and we did a national exit poll, 9,000 voters on election day. And one thing that we found is that if you compared that to the 2020 CNN exit poll, he was basically at the same place with white voters coming out of 2020 into 2024. You know, if you were college educated, you move further to the right. If you were non-college, you move further to the left. They net each other out. But what propelled Donald Trump to the White House, and this is what I'm going to bring up probably several times throughout this, is the fact that it was non-white voters that put Donald Trump in the White House. And so when you look at his job approval, among black men, we have him at 42% job approval. Among Hispanics, he's at 40%. Here's something that's really interesting. I think it's going to define a lot of the issue debates and who Trump is over the next 4 years is whether you're married or unmarried as a woman. And so if you're an unmarried woman right now, likely 2026 voter, 37% disapprove of Donald Trump, 60% disapprove, 37% approve. If you're a married woman, it's 50% approve, 48% disapprove. And so you're starting to see that it's not just gender, it's actually marital status. And as people bring up this constitutional crisis, or we saw threats to democracy grow as an issue, it's all being driven by these unmarried women here. So let's talk about the country for a second here too. Is we're also seeing a big shift in direction of the country, where people are saying that things are more likely to be headed in the right direction. If you look back at our January data, it was still 60-something% wrong track. Now, this is, again, we took that survey before Donald Trump was inaugurated. What did you see move in the last month or so since Trump took office in direction of the country?
Well, a lot of those same groups of African-American men who feel much more optimistic about the direction of the country. And right, you go back to our January national monthly poll, and you had about 28% of voters who said that they felt like that the country was headed in the right direction, and that's jumped 16 points all the way up to 44%. And that number is usually really low. I mean, as you know from doing a lot of these, that usually you have the percentage of people who say that the country is headed in the right direction is usually below 40%. But I think there's a real sense of optimism in the country. Mm-hmm. I think that there, on Twitter or X, a lot of people like to talk about how the vibes seem like they've changed. It really does.
We have a vibe king here at Cygnal, by the way. Our comms director is the vibe king,
Ryan Shuchard.
One thing I noticed in this was that union households, whether you were the union member, there's one in your household, they shifted plus 20 or plus 35% net positive on this question. So we've got Black voters, Hispanic voters, and union voters, all which tend to be Democrat constituencies. Back in April of 2024, Cygnal identified a group of voters that we called the ticked off young, diverse, working class voters. Still, for some reason, haven't workshopped that one into a little bit more concise definition yet. But that audience is really interesting because they actually drove a lot of this shift in sentiment, positive sentiment. And there's still a group. They're a little less ticked off now. But they're still young, diverse, working class voters. That is who is defining the issue battles now. That is who is defining the politics. So, these people had come from Democrats, and we coined in this survey that Democrats are in the dumps. And as you look at this, you've got, Democrats at 40% fav, 54% unfav, and comparing that to Republicans, 47% favorability, 48% unfavorability. I mean, that is a gulf of difference between the two parties where normally they're both kind of disliked it about the same way, but one is not in the dumps and the other one actually looking pretty decent.
That's a 13-point difference between the net image of congressional Republicans and congressional Democrats, which is the largest that I've seen in a long time. Yep. And that's why I think that it is somewhat about the issue set that's being pursued, where people feel like that Elon Musk and President Trump and the administration and congressional Republicans are dialed in to what the concerns of the country are. And it's about, cutting federal spending, and it's about addressing the economy and addressing illegal immigration. And what's crazy to me is that, on X, sometimes or even to the press, Democratic members of Congress will say things like, oh, well, this program, like it's only, 0.2% of the budget. Why does it matter? But the absolute term of absolute dollar amount of some of these programs that's under consideration is in the tens or sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you're one of these voters, if you are a union member, if you're a working class minority young man and you're making $50,000 a year, you're thinking this is crazy. Hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent and wasted. And of course, I want this to be addressed.
Well, some parties always in opposition, and I think Republicans actually play a pretty good opposition and that we're learning how to govern. But it doesn't seem like Democrats have got their feet underneath them at all. And Trump is really baiting them. He's going out and he's signing executive orders on issues that 60, 70, 80% of America agrees with. And the Democrats just can't help themselves but to moan and cry. And they only have 20-30% of voters that are with them on that issue, and they're only with them because they're Democrats. Like paper straws, plastic straws. Name the human that likes paper straws. So Trump signs an executive order about straws. Like, let's think about for a second the legitimacy of the president of the United States getting into a straw debate. But I think it's because he is so good at baiting these Democrats, and that is why they're tanking right now, because they're taking every single piece of bait. And we saw a -7 decrease in their image while Republicans increased by 4. Even Democrats, looking at Democrats, said they're 10% more unfavorable now, net. I mean, your own people are saying you're failing.
Yeah, and Trump has a radar for those issues that split the country 65, 70% support, 30% opposition. The transgender men in sports is a great example of that. We saw that in polling we were doing for clients all across the country last year, where it was even a majority of independents and sometimes a plurality or even a majority of Democrats were with President Trump and conservatives on this issue. But the Democratic, bubble in DC is so beholden to their base on the far progressive left that they would get wrapped in a pretzel around these linguistic terms, and they would just, they were on the wrong side of the issue, and they were never able to recover from it.
Well, looking ahead to the 26 midterms, because we're always looking ahead to the next election, is it too early to look at these numbers and conclude that this image problem for the Democrats is going to play out poorly for them in the midterms?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because I think right now it seems like, Republicans are riding high. The president is riding high. J.D. Vance is getting rave reviews for the speech that he gave on AI policy in Europe, and everything seems to be going well. And as pollsters who are advising clients, our job is to think a year or 2 years ahead and to see what's around the corner and around the bend. What would you say are things that, if Democrats are going to have a ladder back, if they're going to be able to recover, what are the issues that they're going to try to focus on?
So you're asking a Republican pollster to help a Democrat win an election? Is that where we are here? So a couple things. First, and you hit on this well, is the culture wars issue. Democrats are completely on the wrong side of the culture wars issues. And it's like, for some reason, that they're all getting funded by these groups personally into their pockets. Like, there's no reason that they should drive headlong into the buzzsaw of men and women's sports, or here in Arlington, Virginia, where we're recording this, allowing people who say they're a transgendered man, who there's nothing about them that looks anything transgender. They're 100% male, walking into high school swim locker rooms and exposing themselves, and we're protecting that guy. Like, the Democrats are totally off base on what they're focused on. Look at who they appointed for vice chair of the DNC, David Hogg. Like, that is so tone deaf. And I think the implication for the 26 election, I don't want to give Democrats advice on how to win this, but the implications for the election to me are that they're now the party of the coastal elites. And so the more educated you are, the more likely you are to be a Democrat. And those folks are very concentrated in certain areas. It was the problem we as Republicans had 30 years ago, where we had to build our districts around rural, suburban areas and a little bit of rural, because the urban and the rural were Democratic. And all of this is shifting now. And so, we were talking with our friend Adam Kincaid recently at the Redistricting Trust, and looking at what seats shifted. And there's like 24 congressional seats that should come online for Republicans by the end of the decade because of these shifts. And I think a lot of it, they're being driven away from the Democrats on these cultural topics. Before we move on to the next topic here, I do want to bring up two things that I think kind of fit into this narrative of Democrats in the dumps. And first is the CIA recently came out saying that their theory is COVID came out of a lab in China, which is what most normal people knew all along. 65% of Americans say, yes, that's where it came from. 17% said it came from natural causes. This is another topic where Democrats are on the wrong side, because they're in the 17%, while the rest of America is over in the world of reality. Independents 63-16 on this topic. And so, just thinking about what is causing Democrats to be so out of touch. Another is, should we release the RFK, JFK, MLK assassination records, which we're now past the 15-day deadline. We were supposed to see the JFK records that haven't been released yet. But, this is a topic that is very popular among voters, even 55-12 among independents. And then you get to Democrats who are living on their little coastal islands. 27% support, 37% oppose this issue. And I think this just continues to tell the story of how out of touch Democrats are with culture in America right now. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of it is that Democrats suffer from whatever the narrative is that has been set by, let's call it the New York Times, right? They exist in this like bubble where they are unwilling to question that narrative. And so, the origins of COVID, if you go back to 2020 and 2021, it was like the narrative that had been set was, well, of course, this came from, just it was out in the wild. There was no way that it came from a lab. And you had people like Senator Tom Cotton, who was presenting really good evidence to say, no, it looks like it could have come from a lab, actually, right? And I think this speaks to a broader point, which is Democratic office holders are unwilling to actually go outside of what they see as the perceived narrative as it's set by a lot of the mainstream CNN, New York Times, those types of media organizations. But, and we'll get to this a little bit later, but that's not where most American voters are getting their news. Most American,
from the Politburo?
They're
not, okay.
The median American voter is not logging on to the New York Times every day or clicking on CNN or whatever to figure out, what to think about whatever issue. And so that to me is a disconnect that Democrats are going to have to address. I don't see them addressing it anytime soon, but they're going to have to address if they actually want to get back into the business of winning elections.
Well, going back to our exit poll, and I highly recommend going to cygn.al and taking a look at that. If you get your news from newspapers, Harris won those voters by 48 points. It was, and I may be getting that wrong, it may be 60 points. And actually, you know what I think it is broadcast was 48 points. Newspapers was like plus 60 for Harris. Highest educated group of individuals. It kind of goes back to that bubble, DC bubble problem you're talking about, which to me is just coastal big cities, highly educated cocktail circuit problems that the Democrats have. Another issue is all of this discussion around DEI. And, there was an NVT that we did several months ago, maybe even over a year ago, where we asked about, do you support efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And it was highly popular because who is going to not support any of those three terms in their nebulous form? So in this poll, what we did instead was, what is the opposite of DEI? And that is merit-based hiring. And you've earned your way into it. So in this question, I should probably have had this pulled up already. 64% say merit and experience should be how government employees are hired. 3% said racial and gender identity, which, John, you've conducted hundreds and hundreds of polls. You know that anything can get more than 3% just of those jerks that like to take some polls and screw with the results. You get better than 3% at that. So I think that just shows like how crazy it is that the number is only 3%. We should only go off of racial and gender identity, which is basically what DEI is saying. And then we had an option of it's a mix between merit, experience, and racial and gender identity. So, Democrats are really, really in the bucket of DEI, protecting DEI, pushing DEI. It seems like Republicans have done a better job of explaining the consequence of having DEI, which means we get rid of merit and experience. It's not like kumbaya world where, yes, we're all equal. It's that is at the expense of your experience and what you've earned in your life. So, how do you see this playing out for Democrats? What are some of the numbers that stuck out to you in this?
Even among some groups that you might think, so in the question, we asked merit and experience, or so the question was, do you think government employees should be hired more based on merit, experience, or racial and gender identity, or a mix, right? And so as you just said, 64% of voters said merit and experience, only 3% said racial and gender identity, but only 28% said a mix, right? And if you look at, for instance, Hispanic voters, 55% of Hispanic voters said merit and experience versus just 34% who said a mix of those two. But what's interesting is that the Democratic Party is so split on this that they are going to have a civil war between the two wings of their party, where you have some people who are so bought in to this, and they went around and tried to, get every Fortune 500 company to hire a DEI, vice president and do that whole thing. They're going to have to have a civil war, which they have not had yet on the left. And I think that it is really going to, I think that that's going to be something that's going to be tough for them going into 2026, which obviously usually goes pretty well for whichever party is out of power vis-a-vis the White House.
Well, another point that sticks out to me is that among black voters, it's 38% merit and experience. It is 9% racial and gender identity, but more interestingly, it's 39% a mix of the two. And as I look at data points like this, it always sticks out to me as, and you've probably heard me say this, talking about how we should look at and analyze polls, is what are we anchoring to? Like, what are we triangulating against? What are we anchoring to? Because a data point is not beneficial unless it's matched up against some other data point. And so I look at where Donald Trump is in his job approval with black voters, and it's in, I think it's 26%. And then you get a merit and experience at 38% among black voters. So I don't actually look at this data point and say, wow, this is a loser issue among black voters. I actually look at it as this is a wonderful opportunity for Republicans to contrast themselves with Democrats and say, listen, we're the party of you work hard and you get ahead. And when government gets in the way, we get government out of your way. That is who Republicans are. We want you to be free to be successful on your own merits and experience. And this other party wants to say that there are these other factors that matter, these immutable characteristics that are supposed to be how we hire and fire people. The next topic here, tariffs. So this has been one of Donald Trump's favorite words to use. And we asked on this, should we put 10% tariffs on China, 25% on Canada, 25% on Mexico, trying to get an idea of where the support is for this. And, the support of giving tariffs on China was only 50%. And the reason I say only is because this is a arch nemesis, China. And if you say, do you have a positive or negative opinion of China or the Chinese Communist Party, that gets into like 75, 80% poor opinion, bad opinion of China or the Chinese Communist Party. But then when you say tariffs on this, it only goes down to 50%. And one thing that really stuck out to me on this is the fact that I don't think people know what tariffs are. Like, I think they're familiar that it's some other country's obligation to pay. I don't think they have any clue where this fits into the economy as a whole, because the economy is such a massive concept. Like, it's hard to wrap your mind. Like you mentioned, the $50,000 guy saying hundreds of millions going places. Like, it's just a number they'll never experience. They have nothing to anchor it against. They don't know what $100 million looks like. And for the economy, it's, I don't know what trillions of dollars look like. What do you think in this is actually an opportunity for Republicans to hone in the messaging around tariffs that we're not? Because the other two numbers are only 39% support the tariffs on Canada, only 43% support the tariffs on Mexico. So you've got Donald Trump expending all this political capital on something that barely gets to 50% when you add the name China to it. And China to it. What are Republicans missing in this messaging here?
I think part of this is that there's some misunderstanding about trade deficits and, as you said, what tariffs are. But I think it's also important to kind of look at, 50% say they support the tariff on China, and maybe that's a little bit lower number than you would expect. But you also have to keep in mind that only 36% were opposed. So it was plus 14 in the difference in net support for the tariff on China. And
do you know who opposes it?
Well, and the people who oppose it, you have 65%.
Party of the Politburo.
You have 65% of Democrats who are opposed to it, and you have 10% of Republicans and 35% of independents who are opposed to it. But I think that the vice president did a really good job in kind of defending this and kind of explaining it. And I do think that voters draw a pretty sharp distinction, which you can see here in the data, between tariffs that are enacted against countries like China, who are known as our main adversary, and then countries like Canada, who most Americans, your average American voter, just has a pretty positive view of the country for the most part, and then tariffs that are enacted against Mexico. And I think on Mexico, the thing that Republicans have to do, if we went back to that, if the Trump administration went back to that, would be to draw a stronger line between the war on fentanyl and why that is accomplishing the goal that that the country needs to accomplish, and why the tariff is the necessary thing to do that. But I think, you also, I think, have to keep in mind the context of all this, which is the majority of economists have been saying for 3 decades, tariffs they're from the past. They're from an age that, that's a century ago.
The globalist economists.
And so that is kind of, the voters are ahead of where the economists are. And so I think,
do you think the economists have graduate degrees?
I think they have many graduate degrees.
So they're probably Democrats?
Most likely.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to totally throw you off on that one. Just trying to drive the educational attainment point home here. I really see this tariff issue as an opportunity to explain what has been lost by Americans and how a tariff is a solution to that. And this is really any politician's job. It's any job for a public affairs professional who's pushing or advocating for against an issue. Is you have to very clearly and easily explain what has somebody lost or what will they lose. Because as humans, we're way more likely to go protect ourselves from loss than we are to seek some future gain. And I think that's the missing piece of this conversation here is that, okay, well, what is a 25% tariff? Like the Democrats are going to start calling it the Trump tax. If it doesn't show up on a receipt under the subtotal line and say Trump tax, it's not going to land with voters from a messaging standpoint. But I think Republicans have got to get out there and explain what happened, how were you threatened, what have you lost, and how is then the tariff fits into the conversation.
Let me ask you a question on this. If the economy is growing pretty strongly in 2026, and if inflation has continued to come down, do you think this issue matters at all?
I mean, I venture to say, based on these polling numbers, voters aren't focused on tariffs. They don't see it as an issue because they don't understand it. There's not a lot of intensity on any of these 3 countries that we tested about putting tariffs on the goods and services coming from them. So, I mean, the only reason I think it would be an issue is all of a sudden if everything has gotten more expensive. But Trump is not going to set forth something that is going to drastically increase the cost of things if there's not some net benefit of a decrease somewhere or an increase in income. And so, everything is relative because Joe Biden's wasted way too much of his administration or whoever actually ran the country at that time, and that just used him as a mouthpiece. They told Americans, you're really stupid because here are all the reasons the economy's doing well. And regular Americans were sitting there going, well, my economy sucks. I had to cancel a vacation. My kid had to wear cleats for the second soccer season in a row, and their toes are bleeding because I can't afford new cleats for them. But that's the reality for most Americans. And we have to remember that politics is 2 things. First off, politics is entertainment, which is why Donald Trump is slaying it right now because he is so freaking entertaining. And 2, it is relative. And it does not matter what some economic indicator says. It only matters what some voter feels. And so that's why, long way about going to your question on, is this an issue in 2026? So another big topic. First off, thanks for hanging with us if you're still listening or still watching us. This is, again, the first time we've ever done this format, so we appreciate you sticking with us. But next up is everybody's favorite South African, Elon Musk. No offense to Nelson Mandela fans, but the current living South Africans, Elon Musk. And he has been in the news a ton. We've tested his image a couple times, his favorability and his unfavorability. He's actually not taken on that much water, interestingly, over the last month, where he's gone from being kind of in the news to he is the news now. Everything is about Elon Musk. Democrats are saying that they're going to make their entire messaging against Republicans that this billionaire is controlling the government. I also think that's going to land flat. But he's leading DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. And we tested in this survey support for that, not calling it DOGE, not seeing if people were favorable or unfavorable of it. But the question specifically was asking about the effort to cut the size and scope of government. So I'll read the question, then I want your thoughts on it, John. So do you support or oppose Donald Trump's efforts led by Elon Musk to reduce the size of government by federal employee buyouts, funding cuts, and department closures? Because that's the three tools thus far used by this. And what are you seeing in the data on this question?
Swing voters are +7 in support of this, right? And a plurality of voters, 46% support it, 45% are opposed. A lot of it just kind of falls into the general partisan buckets. But swing voters are +7 in support of it. This is an issue that does not hurt, and it will help as things move along. Right now, the media is saying this is chaotic, this is terrible, and you have all the negative attention. But as more and more money is saved, and as people start to see the hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to be saved via
trillions,
cuts,
they say
trillions potentially, right? Then you're going to see that the support for this this effort increase, right? One thing that's interesting on Elon's image in particular is that it's very segmented by gender, and so women tend to have a little bit more negative view of him. Men are a much more positive view of him. And so, having him included in the question actually probably bent down the support, maybe
which was
just
the
a little
purpose,
bit.
yeah.
Right. But I agree with you. Like, it's clear that for congressional Democrats, they see this as their ladder back to relevance, right? And so they're outside all of these federal agencies in DC, and they're saying, they're protesting, and they're, Elizabeth Warren is leading the crowds and chants and all that sort of thing. But the vast majority of American voters have no idea what these agencies are,
just a bunch of letters,
what they do, and they're going to be shocked at how much money is spent at these agencies for no return to the average American voter. And so I think it's a pretty big strategic mistake for Democrats to focus on this. They're obviously going to try to make, this is like an oligarchy type argument or whatever, but it's kind of tough to make that argument when Elon and his guys are just going through and literally just going through the budgets line by line and then asking people, hey, what do you do here? And trying to figure out how to save the American taxpayer dollars money. Nobody in the right mind thinks that Donald Trump is not the president, despite what Time may put on their most recent cover.
It's a pretty good picture of Elon on the cover. One thing that sticks out to me in this number is the fact that there's only 17% support among black voters for this effort and 63% in opposition. So that, again, all numbers need to be triangulated and anchored against others to make sense. And this is the lowest number. It's the largest spread and the lowest number of any of the questions that we asked among black voters. And so I do see that as an area that Trump needs to watch his six on and figure out what is the messaging to the black community to explain how this is actually a benefit to them and not a detriment to them. It's not taking anything away from them. It's actually adding to them and taking away from the man, taking away from the establishment, taking away from big fill in the blank, or whatever you want to call it. Another piece on this is looking at the implications of this. Republicans, you've been doing campaigns for 15 years now, maybe longer. And then we've got within this, Republicans have forever run on cutting government. Like, name the last mailer you've seen, especially in a Republican primary, that did not say cut the size of government or cut government. But nobody's actually ever gone and done it. And this is the first time federally that we're really seeing this play out. And I would say that this is going to be harder when it gets to Congress. Once this gets to the actual legislating of purse strings, I think this is going to be a lot more complicated because there's a whole lot more interest involved there than there is Elon walking into what are relatively smaller government agencies and making cuts. So last big topic here is the immigration crackdowns. And I think you mentioned this when we were talking about the massive action that Donald Trump is taking. that you see videos of C-17s, Globemasters being flown out, with immigrants and dropping them off in their countries, and these Christie gnomes showing up at raids in New York City. Like, there's definitely a lot of optics around this right now, and the Democrats are saying, well, that he's deporting half the amount of people that Joe Biden deported, while also leaving out the fact that Joe Biden opened the back door and let 12 million of them in the process. That aside, where are voters on this issue of immigration, sanctuary cities, like these ICE raids? What are you seeing in the data here?
Yeah, so the initial question that we asked in this was, do you support or oppose the actions taken thus far by the Trump administration in relation to illegal immigration and border security? So just a nice, broad question to see where people were environmentally. And 53% of the American public said that they support the actions by the administration as it relates to illegal immigration, and only 38% oppose, right? So you have plus 15 in support, and among swing voters, it's plus 29 in support on these actions. And so, this has always been, illegal immigration has always been the second or the third highest priority for voters. Whenever you ask the question,
it actually dropped in this poll. Do you think that's because they're finally seeing action on it, so they're a little less worried about it?
That's my guess. Is that what you think?
Yeah. And I also look at this number and say, okay, well, those are great net positives. Only 38% of people oppose this. So the group of people, again, Democrats love finding themselves these 20 and 30% support issues where they're just on the total opposite side of a decent to really strong majority of folks. And only 27% of voters strongly oppose Trump's actions thus far in tackling border security and illegal immigration. And you'll be shocked to know this. It's the Democrats who drive that. They're just on the wrong side of this over and over again. It's also one of those topics that, again, people take action when they feel threatened, when they feel especially threat of loss. I'm going to lose something. And this is why I think this issue is so potent. Donald Trump won 89% of voters who said that illegal immigration was their top issue. And it was about the only issue that if he could find somebody who cared about that issue and get them to turn out to vote, it was almost 100% chance he was going to get that person's vote if he turned them into a voter, which we can maybe get into another pulse pod on, like the fact of how many people he turned into the electorate that changed the electoral composition. But I think it's because voters look at this and say, those folks, like, I have no problem with them personally. Human to human, we're fine. But there are drugs coming across, there's human traffic coming across the border. They're taking government benefits that are due for American citizens, and they are threatening our schools and our healthcare systems. And I just see this as the quintessential issue of voters feeling threatened, and Donald Trump is stepping in as the savior on the topic and taking away that concern, which is why we saw that drop in the top issue on this here.
Do you think that how do you think this issue will impact the midterms? And I mean, as the Trump administration obviously has been very aggressive in how they've gone after this, and they're going to continue to be very aggressive. So do you see the saliency of this issue declining, or does it continue to be a kind of a pivotal issue as we approach 2026?
I see it as being still a base issue for Republicans, because when you look at this topic, 67% of men 55 plus are supportive of these efforts. But when you drop down to men under 55, because that's about a clean 50-50 break in age distribution, only 53% support. Women 55 plus, it's 52%. Women under 55, it's 39%. So when you start to look at these pieces of what's driving the support, how many men over 55, if you're not voting yet, you're all of a sudden turning into a voter? That's a pretty solid voter base of folks, and they're pretty Republican already. So I actually do see the saliency of this issue dropping beyond a turnout tool for older men, because it's going to be really hard 2 years from now, or less than 2 years from now, to get out there and Trump's still the face of the party and say, look at this threat of what's coming across the border. We have to secure the border. And voters are like, well, isn't that what you've been doing the last 2 years? So I do really see that we're going to have to, as Republicans, pivot and find something else. Of course, continuing to tackle this. It cannot be fixed in 2 years. It's been unfettered for decades. It is not going to be fixed in 2 years. So maybe part of it is continuing to, again, you got to remind voters what is the threat to them. You can't just throw out solutions. You got to throw out solutions to things people actually feel threatened by on this. So any closing thoughts or any other data points that stuck out to you?
I go back to what I said at the very beginning, which is I think that I think if you went back to the first administration, I think in thinking about it, Trump is probably a little frustrated because he was advised to take on healthcare first and try to repeal Obamacare. And obviously
Thanks, John
wasn't
McCain.
right. And obviously that wasn't successful. And they have very intentionally said, we're going to focus on just two things. We're going to focus on immigration and then really attacking what they call the fourth estate, the federal government, and with DOGE cutting the size of the federal government and really reforming and eliminating fraud there. And there's been a lot, I think that's been a really successful strategy so far. And, congressional Democrats are not helping themselves with how they're responding.
Well, I think one thing that we need to close with is this ticked off young, diverse working class voters that we identified in April of 24. They are way more focused on inflation and economy. Their number two issue, this is 20% of voters. Their number two issue is healthcare at 17%. Illegal immigration is at 7% among these voters. It's the GOP base that's driving the immigration issue. So, I really recommend that Republicans take a hard look at what are we doing on the economy? What are we doing on inflation even more than the economy specifically? What wins can you chalk up there that voters start to actually feel within their pocketbook or their paycheck? And because this voter group is who propelled them to the White House, and it will also be the people who stay home and would have voted for Republican if they actually showed up to vote. And we've got to be talking to their issues too, not just illegal immigration in the fourth state. So
I have one final question for you. Do you think that the files related to the assassinations of JFK, Robert Kennedy, and MLK Jr., will they be released?
I really hope so. Oliver Stone definitely threw me into the conspiracy, the JFK assassination conspiracy camp. I mean, incredibly well done movie. That was Kevin Costner, right? Was the main character in that?
I've actually never seen that movie.
Oh gosh, John, I know what you are doing tonight. You are going to watch JFK. It's easy to find. Just called JFK. So with that, again, super long. We've never done this format before. We've never done video. We've never done back and forth. We've never sat down and done it before. So the fact that you made it through listening to this whole thing, thank you all. And with that, follow us on X, CYGNAL is our handle. And we're also on the other social medias. Check out our website at cygn.al and stay tuned for numbers in March.